Chapter 5. Are you sure you have to do this? My mother asked as we drove along. Are you sure you want me to pass civics? There has to be more pleasant places in a better part of town where you could have done your hours. I had to agree that pleasant and better certainly weren't words I'd use to describe either the soup kitchen or the streets that surrounded it. I started it, so I'm going to finish it. I just wish you hadn't started it working at a place like that. That would have been my wish as well. Unfortunately, most of what I wished for didn't come true. At least one of the few benefits of this placement had was that it offended my mother. She always liked things to be so proper, so precise, so tidy and organized. This was none of those things. That it bothered my mother most almost made up for me having to give up a Friday night. Almost. I'd rather be out with my friends, but I had to do the hours as soon as possible. It was a shame I didn't get credit for the time I'd spent thinking about the soup kitchen, or I'd have already been through with my community hours. I couldn't get it out of my mind, and the more I thought about it, the less real it all seemed. It was like I'd watched a movie about it instead of actually being there. Tonight I was dressed better. By that, I mean I dressed worse. Old coat, as close to beat up as I could find. It sort of belonged to my father. It was what he used to wear when he did yard work, at least when he used to do yard work. It had been years since he'd cut the grass or raked the leaves or shoveled the snow. Now there was a landscape company that did all that, and another company that took care of the pools, and another that washed the windows. He was far too busy and too important to do any of those jobs. Now, if he could just find somebody parent, he wouldn't have to show up at all. I had also dug up an old pair of sneakers. They were scuffed and worn out. I was sure nobody would want to steal them, and if they did, I'd gladly give them up without a fight. I still don't know why you couldn't have dressed a bit better, my mother said, repeating the refrain I'd heard since she first saw my outfit. Like I said, it's better to dress down. If I look like I might have money, then somebody might want to try and get that money from me. Then by all means, just give them $1 or two so they'll leave you alone. She said, your father always gives those squeegee kids $1 so they won't scratch up his car. It's not like we can't afford it. Can we afford for me to have my wallet ripped off, or my shoes or jacket stolen, or for me to be bashed over the head? Please, Ian, don't be so dramatic. I'm not being. Fine, whatever. I was tempted to tell her what had happened the other night in the park, but I stopped myself. I'd save that for later and spring it on her at just the right time. And it's such a long distance from home, such a long way to drive, she said. Sorry to inconvenience you, I said icily. It's not that. You don't even have time to drive me. I can get there and back on my own. If it's such a big hassle, I'll take the subway home tonight. Not from this part of the city, and certainly not at night. I was so happy she'd said that. I'd only been bluffing. A drive was a lot nicer and safer. They'd just have to keep driving me places until I got my license and my own car. That was the reason I was going in the first place. It was important not to lose sight of that. You can let me off anywhere along here, I suggested. We were within a block now. I'll drop you off right out front where I picked you up the other night. I'd rather not have you on these streets by yourself. I can take care of myself. You think you can take care of yourself, but you have no idea what goes on in this part of town. Sure, fine, whatever. Actually, I was a little embarrassed to be driven up to the soup kitchen in a Mercedes that probably cost more than all the meals that had been served there for the past year. I grabbed a toque off the seat and pulled it low over my head. It was an old ratty one, and it was tight fit. Although it certainly would help me fit in down here, was it some sort of rule that every street person wear a toque? My mother pulled the car over to the curb directly in front of the building. There was no line up in front. I'd been hoping that was the case. It was still early, not even 5 o'clock, and I was here to help with the setup. You'd think they could do something about this place, my mother said. Fix it up, or they spend their money on other things, like food for the street people. I just think a little bit of paint wouldn't cost much, and it certainly would improve the image. Appearance don't mean much that down here, I said. Judging from your appearance, that's pretty obvious. I think they believe it isn't what you look like, but what you do. I opened the car door and climbed out. Call when you know what time. I slammed the door shut, using the fine German engineering of the car to close her out. I turned and walked away without looking back. I'd gone no more than a few steps when I heard the car pull away, leaving behind a small squeal of rubber on the pavement. She was obviously mad. Good. It shouldn't just be me who was mad all the time. I grabbed the handle of the door to the club and tried to pull it open. It rattled, but didn't open. I knocked. It echoed loudly. I waited, listening for an answer. There was none. I knocked again. This time louder and longer. Still nothing. I'd be awfully ticked if I'd come all down here early like we'd agreed and Mac wasn't here. Either way, though, whether I was in there working or out here standing, I was still counting as a volunteer hour. I knocked again, no answer. Either Mac wasn't here or he was just ignoring the noise. He probably got a lot of people pounding on the door wanting to get inside to eat. It wasn't like most of the homeless people had watches. Maybe there was another way in. I circled around the alley at the side of the building. I'd gone no more than a few feet when I was stopped in my tracks by the sight of two legs sticking out from under a dumpster, beside a dumpster. Was somebody dead, or I gave my head a shake. It was probably just somebody waiting for supper. They would have figured this was a good place to get out of the wind. I walked forward, angling out and away from that side of the alley. I glanced over and then stopped for a better look. It was an old man sitting on the ground, leaning against the walls, his eyes closed, a half-empty bottle in his hand. As I stood there, he opened one eye and looked at me. He mumbled something. I couldn't hear, and then his eye fell shut again. He certainly wasn't dead, not unless you counted dead drunk. As I got to the end of the alley, I saw a large truck backed in, so it was tucked close to the open rear of the building. At that instant, Matt came out through the door and grabbed a box from the back of the truck. He looked up, saw me, and waved. Just in time, he called out, "Grab a box." I rushed over. The truck was piled high with crates and cardboard boxes and bins. I picked one up. "What's in all of these?" I asked. "This is a place where people come to get food. So, this is all food." Bingo. I trailed after Mac, and as we entered the building, a man came out. "Extra hands is good," he said. We had on a shirt emblazoned with Second Harvest Trucking on the front, so I assumed he was the driver. Mac set his box down on the table and was already piled high with other boxes. I went to put mine down when he stopped me. "That one goes in the freezer. Follow me, I'll show you." Mac led the way to the large metal door. He opened it up and gestured for me to enter. It was immediately hit with a wave of cold. It was a gigantic walk-in freezer. The walls were lined with shelves, and the shelves were lined with boxes and containers. "Put it right here," Mac said. "There's a whole lot of food in here. Enough for 8 or 9 days. "That's got to be more than that. Second time here and the kid thinks he's an expert," Mac said. "No, it's just that—" Mac started laughing, his breath coming out in little white puffs in the cold. "You gotta lighten up, kid. I was just pulling your leg." We walked out of the freezer and he closed the door behind us with a loud metallic click. It takes a lot of food to feed more than 100 men a day. A lot of food and a whole lot of work. Glad to see you're here, although I'm a little surprised. "Why are you surprised? This is when I was supposed to be here, right?" "That's the time we agreed to, but lots of people who show up once don't show up again, especially people who aren't used to this sort of thing, people who come from privilege." "What makes you think that's me?" I asked. "Well, for starters, the way you were dressed last time in that expensive coat and shoes. You made a better choice this time," he said. "I thought I could fit in better this way," I admitted, feeling a little embarrassed. "But lots of people own a coat like the one I was wearing. That doesn't mean my family is rich." "Maybe not the coat, but certainly the Mercedes that picked you up. That one probably cost more than 100 grand, right?" I nodded my head. It was one of the top-of-the-line cars, but how did he know what sort of car picked me up? Had he been spying on me? "I was watching when you left, peeking out of the window to make sure you got picked up safe," Max said, answering my unspoken thoughts. "Doesn't matter what car picked me up or dropped me off," I said, feeling a bit defensive. "All that matters is that I'm putting in my hours, so I'm here." Mac laughed. "Like I said, that's one of the things I like about you, kid. You aren't going to give me some crap about helping the poor. You're here to do a job. Honest, I like that. But there are other places where you could have done your hours. You could have weaseled out of being here. That's what my mother wanted me to do. But you didn't do what she wanted. How come?" I considered giving a completely honest answer. I hardly ever did what my mother or father wanted unless I had no choice. "I told you I'd be here, so I'm here," I said. That wasn't a complete lie. "Good. How about if you continue unloading the truck while I finish making supper? Unless you want to do the cooking and I'll start doing the unloading." "I think I'll do the unloading. Lifting I know how to do. Cooking for 100 people I don't." "Same as cooking for 2 people, just multiply all the ingredients by 50. I went out to continue unloading. Each time I came in with a box, I caught a glimpse of Mac working at the stove. It wasn't just that I didn't know how to cook for 100 people. I didn't know how to cook for 2, or even 1. I never needed to. Berta did all that. Berta was my nanny when I was a baby, and then when I didn't have a nanny anymore, she became our housekeeper and organizer. She had an apartment in her basement, and she was always there. My mother said Berta was sort of like the family's wife who took care about the all-day-to-day business of running her household. I didn't think of her like anybody's wife, but she was family. She'd always been there. She was there when I came home from school. Because of her, the house was never empty, and because my father and mother were always so busy with business meetings and travel, and of course social things. It would have been empty without her. Filled with lots of expensive things, but empty. I couldn't even imagine what it would be like without Berta around. Thank goodness I've never known, and I never have to know. I guess it also worked out for Berta. She was originally from Guatemala, and that's where all her family still lived. So I guess in some ways we were like her family too. I'd once started to figure out how often I ate with my parents and how often it was with me, just me and Berta. I looked back for 2 or 3 weeks and then stopped. There was no point in quantifying what I already knew. Not that there was anything wrong with eating with Berta. I liked eating with her. I liked being with her. She had a soft, gentle laugh, and she always seemed to know what questions to ask, and just as important, what questions not to ask. Those were the times I told her the rest of the story anyways. I always knew I could trust her. She didn't judge me, although she did offer advice. Softly spoken with her lilting accent. I loved her accent. My parents told me that when I was a little I spoke English with a Spanish accent. That shouldn't have been a surprise, since she'd spent more time with me than my mother did. Much more to go, Mac asked. Almost done. Good. When you're finished, you can start bringing out the plates and cups and utensils. Sure. By the way, what's for supper tonight, I asked. Spaghetti with meat sauce. Mac lifted the lid on the biggest pot I'd ever seen. He grabbed a wooden spoon, a spoon that was about the same size as a canoe paddle, and stirred the bright red sauce that was bubbling away. He needed to use both hands to move the contents. I'm sure there's lots and lots of vegetables in the sauce, Mac said. Best thing to protect them from getting scurvy. Scurvy? Isn't that what the sailors got in the old days? You know, like Christopher Columbus? Yep. Being at sea for a long time without fruits and vegetables does that. And street people get it? They don't get what you call a balanced diet. Speaking of which, have you eaten, Mac asked. I hadn't, and it was too early to claim I had. I shook my head. Finish up and I'll set out 2 bowls before we let the crowd in, okay? You're sure there'll be enough for everybody, I asked. There will be, but that's mighty nice of you to ask. I was in charge of serving the spaghetti. I was using a big pair of serving tongs. Mac was putting on the sauce. His job was easier. Those were hard to get out of the pot and onto the plate. It almost seemed like they were alive and struggling to stay in the pot so they wouldn't be eaten. And when I did convince the noodles to leave, it was hard to get just the right amount, the right serving size. If I put on too much, I couldn't very well reach out and take it back. And if I didn't put on much or enough, I would get somebody mad. It was much simpler serving the stew the other night. 2 scoops, plop, plop. An old grizzled man stood in front of me, tray in hand. I wondered how old he was. I was finding that everybody looked old and worn. He could have been 50, but he could have been 150. Is it any good, he asked. It's really good, I answered. It was good enough for me to have eaten 2 full servings. It doesn't smell right. I thought it smelled pretty good. It's the garlic in the sauce you're smelling. They put something in the sauce. There's lots of things. Garlic, green peppers, onions. Says who, the old man demanded. Well, me, I guess. And who are you and who do you work for? The old man snapped. I didn't know what to say. The old man started to snarl. His teeth, those that he had, yellowed and crooked and grubby, were locked together in a fierce-looking grimace, and he started to make strange noises. Why is he growling? What did you put in the sauce? He yelled. He raised his fist and started shaking it toward me. I backed a half step away. I felt a rush of adrenaline surge through my body. I realized that everybody stopped talking or shuffling or eating, and all eyes were on us. I didn't put anything in the... It's okay, Max said, stepping forward and cutting me off. How do I know it ain't poison? The old man demanded. How do I know this ain't another plot to get me and everybody else in here? He gestured around the room. Come on, buddy, you've been coming here alone. You know what I wouldn't poison you or let anybody else poison you, Mac reasoned. You know me. The old man stopped growling and he lowered his fist. Those had to be a good sign. He looked at Mac, long and hard, like he was trying to figure out if what he was saying was true. His grimace dissolved into a twisted, broken smile, like he suddenly realized it was Mac. I felt myself relax. That had looked like it was going to end my really bad, and Mac had managed to handle it so that... How do I know it's you? The old man demanded. How do I know they didn't kill the real Mac and replace him with you when they poisoned the food? How do I know you're not an alien? He yelled. He raised his fist and started to growl again. If he wasn't old and frail, and if Mac wasn't here, I would have been afraid. Actually, I was afraid. I'd never seen anybody this crazy this close up. When I poisoned myself, Max said, his voice calm and quiet, he reached into the pot and grabbed a noodle, stuffing it into his mouth. Next, he took a spoon, dipped it in the sauce, and took a sample. See, Max? Once again, the man lowered his fist, and the growling was replaced by a throaty, scratchy laugh. Mac, it's you, right? Who else would be stupid enough to be here, you old buzzard? The man held out his hand, and they shook. Go ahead, Mac said. Serve 'em. The old man held out his tray. Carefully, very carefully, he put on some spaghetti. Thank you so much, young man, he said sweetly. Next, Mac poured on the sauce, giving him an extra big serving, and the man shuffled off to eat. Thanks, I said to Mac. No problem. That's why I'm here. Sometimes you just gotta enter into their heads and figure out what they're thinking. I can't believe that. He actually thought you were an alien who was here to poison him. That's why I had to sample the sauce to prove him wrong. But what I don't understand is if he thought you were an alien, isn't it possible that what poisons human isn't going to hurt an alien? Shh, Mac hissed. Let's not give anybody else any ideas. That's good advice, another voice said. I looked up to the man standing in front of me, holding out his tray. It was a man from the park. Good to see you, Mac exclaimed. The two men shook hands over the counter. Haven't seen you for a while. Good to have you back. How have you been? Mac asked. I'm fine. More important, how's your food today? Good as always, Mac said. See for yourself, Ian. Give the Sarge a big serving, 'cause he's a big guy. The same as everybody else would be fine, he said softly. I pulled out a blob of spaghetti, and as it had been getting colder, it had become increasingly more difficult to manage. Whether he wanted it or not, he was getting a bigger serving. Thank you. I see you have a different jacket today. I trust that was a choice and not something forced on you. I thought it was smarter to wear this when I'm around the neighborhood. Wise move. Do you know each other? Mac asked. We met briefly in the park, the man said. He kindly offered me some spare change. He's a nice young man. Yeah, I think he's a keeper, Mac said. I'm sure he is. Merci to both. He nodded his head and then walked off looking for a seat. I watched as he walked. There was no shuffle or stagger in his step. His back was as straight as a rod. He looked more like he was marching than walking. You called him Sarge, I said. That's what everybody calls him. It's not his name. That's just what we call him. He was in the army before, is what I heard. That would explain the way he walked, the way he held himself, the way he knocked the man down and wielded that iron bar. So he was a sergeant? Might have been, Max said with a shrug. He gets called Sarge, the way some people who used to drive a taxi get called cabbie. Everybody here nickname, and sorry, and a story, Max said. And what's his story, I asked. What I know I'll tell you sometime, Mac paused. That is, if you tell me the rest of the story about you and meeting him. I get the feeling there's more there. I nodded my head. It's a deal.